This video, we're going to be covering a little bit about group management. Generally speaking, MCNC will handle this for you on the back end, and you don't need to know much about it. However, if you do have groups of computers or users that need an extra bit of TLC, this will be the video to pay attention to as we cover some of the ways we can, tweak the onboarding and, groups we have to specifically cater to them. As always, we're going to jump in our host management screen here. Do make sure you're logged into your CID, and as always, you can pivot here from your white Falcon and going over to hosts management under the hosts column. I am starting here today because we can close off a few toggles here and get a little bit of a cleaner view of what we're looking at. We're not going to care so much about, we'll care about grouping tags here. And one of the important things to keep in mind is that by default, MCNC tries to make our managed endpoint service as easy to use as possible. Basically, just get the agent installed on there, keep an eye on Discover, keep an eye on Spotlight, you should be good to go. When you have sets of devices that need a little bit extra attention to them though, and I'm not just talking about your basic domain controller or your, database server. Crowdstrike is trained against all of that. It's part of why we chose them. You install to it just like you would a Windows 10 client, not a bunch of concern there. However, if you look at things like your internal IT staff who want to stay an agent version ahead, that way they can make sure they catch problems, or if you have some Linux devices and you always want to stay on the newest possible kernel, that's where we start looking at this. Or imagine if you have a couple of legacy devices and they have a piece of software that we've determined that for whatever reason needs a CrowdStrike exclusion, however you don't want that exclusion to apply to all other devices. That's where all of this is going to come into play. So at the very, outset here in host management, we can see the basic stuff. So we've got our host names. If you have a good naming convention, you'll be able to tell what they are. If not, you can start to see their OS version. Ideally, CrowdStrike will have scraped a little bit more information, such as your OU and site. However, we can also look at model kernel version OS build. Part of why I'm covering all of this is that's how groups work. We can do groups in two manners. We can do either the dynamic grouping, which is what we default to, or we can start to use some of these filters or some of these taggings here to perform a little bit more granular action on them. One way we could do it is by saying this command line device here will need to be in its own group. If we check it and click actions, we can add a grouping tag of command line install, and by clicking add tag, we have the tag CLI install here. Now when we want to manage devices with that, we can just use our autocomplete of tags. And we can start to look for ones that, have no tags. Or if we wanted to come in here, when this will load up in a moment, we can see now that it's populated, we could search by ones that are just tagged CLI install. This could be done as simply as finding the devices you want that are in your IT staff, and if they have an inherent OU or something like that to them, you can use that, or if you want to be certain, you can use a grouping tag of, say, IT staff. Now, where do we actually interact with groups? There, you'll go up here to the white Falcon, and you'll click the hosts column, and then groups is right under host management. Again, MCNC will handle all of this for you. You don't have to worry about this noise. Just understand that this is how in the back end we'll help migrate devices from training policies to baselines, or if we need to perform more advanced troubleshooting on some of them, we'll have that here. Generally speaking, you're going to have 4 basic groups, and 3 of them are captured here. So oftentimes we're going to have a Windows Server group, a Windows client. We'll also have a Linux server, and we'll have a Mac client. We don't have any Macs that we're actively working with in our lab, so we don't have the Mac group. And we just have basic Linux, both workstation and server, since we have some Ubuntu in here, so we've just abbreviated this to all. Generally speaking, the naming convention will be an abbreviated version of your school, the type of device it applies to, whether it's client, server, if it's database, if it's web server, we can put the appropriate abbreviations there. And then we'll have group, and we call out whether you're on baseline or training, and then we'll touch on update. Generally speaking, you have update N2, which is your N-2, with N-1 being one revision newer, and update QA being the bleeding edge. And then we'll also always see our RTR scripts here, just to indicate that yes, it does have a real-time response policy, where the MCNC admins can execute scripts and a little bit more advanced interaction if needed. Some of the ways we can interact with this, though, is when we open up a group here, we can start to see the types of policies applied to it and the number of hosts. Red would indicate that this is the enforced policy. So if you have a device that was offline when you made a policy change, you may see something like 3 hosts are here highlighted in red, and 1 host may be back on something like a training policy, and that's just simply because it hasn't been brought online to update. If we wanted to create a group, though, we can start detailing how it's done. So for this, I'll just put in test group to keep it simple. We can always put in a description, so test group for video. And here's where we get an idea of how we can use host groups, as well as a dynamic link to Crowdstrike documentation if you wish to learn a little bit more. Within here, though, the preferred way is dynamic. So as I said, we have a Windows client group. How do we determine Windows client? Well, the search query is as simple as knowing that it's platform Windows and that the type of device is workstation. That is self-reported by the device. However, other entries here could be something simple like the host name for it or anything else. So we can click our assignment rules here and imagine we created that group. And we can see that anything you can search for here can be pulled into a group, including the sensor version. Of course, if you put sensor version into a group that dynamically updates, that's not going to make sense. You also have an RFM selection, pod name, OS version, build, everything here. Even certain things such as your local IP and your external IP, if for whatever reason you wanted devices to have a weaker policy if they were on a given domain or something, and when they're at home on a 192.168, they have a stronger policy. Again, all of that's a little bit more complicated. We tried to achieve simplicity because with simplicity comes better security. The more complex something is, the harder it is to secure. So generally speaking, we'll look at something like grouping tags. And as always, it'll autocomplete. So if I were to save this, this group would end up only applying to this one device that has the CLI install tag. Important thing to note is that this was a Falcon grouping tag given within the console. If you were to do a command line install on Windows, Mac, or Linux and you were to pass a tag that way, it would be called a sensor tag instead. There is a minor difference there because you have to specify whether it's a Falcon grouping tag or a sensor tag, and that would autocomplete in that selection if you have those in your environment. And then you would save and you would only get that one device instead of these 6. The other way to create a group, and we'll just key in test is static by either host ID or host name. We prefer host name because that's a little bit more easy to relate to and discuss. And the same way is when you want to add hosts, you'll just manually check the ones that will statically be assigned in the group. So if we wanted only devices that were CLI and GUI, independent of anything else, in here, we could select those 2, click Add, and they would reside in this group now. Other ways to sort through this is even though you're setting what's essentially a static group by their hostname selected here, you could also use the tagging option or any of the other metrics to choose them. So for here, I could choose command line install, select this one, click Add, and it would be added to this group. Hopefully that gives you a brief overview of the groups and some of the ways they can be interacted with. The short of it is, by default, you don't have to worry about this at all, but the long is, if you have a group of devices that need some special attention, talk to your onboarding engineer, talk to MCNC, or open a ticket, and we can start to try and tweak things around in the most sensible manner for you. Thank you, and stay secure. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to share it out with folks in your cohort or anybody you think it could be useful to. We're all in this migration journey together. And always remember, if you have any questions, we're here to help, and you know how to get a hold of us.